At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation, long suppressed, finds utterance. It is fitting that at this solemn moment, we take the pledge of dedication to the service of India and her people, and to the still larger cause of humanity.
Could you recognize the person who was giving the speech right now? It was none other than Jawaharlal Nehru himself. That was his famous Tryst with Destiny speech, which he gave when India achieved independence. He ended that historic speech with the following words: "And so we have to labor and work hard to give reality to your dreams. Those dreams are for India, but they are also for the world." What did you understand from the speech? When Jawaharlal Nehru mentioned that at the stroke of midnight hour, he was referring to no other hour than the midnight of the 15th of August 1947, when India achieved its independence. And that made Nehru the first Prime Minister of independent India. The dreams that he mentioned were nothing other than freedom, independence, cooperation and peace. And he also realized that those dreams are not meant for India alone, and they are to be shared and achieved by the entire world. Now, in that very speech, Nehru gave the world an idea of his internationalist mentality. And that brings us to the topic for this lesson: Nehru's roles and contributions to the non-aligned movement. Now, why are we discussing specifically Nehru's role itself? Now, we do remember that Jawaharlal Nehru was one of the founding fathers of the non-aligned movement. But so was Nkrumah, Nasser, Tito, as well as Sukarno. And why are we not discussing their roles and contributions as well? Is it because we are Indians and so is Nehru? Absolutely not. The reason why Nehru's role to a non-aligned movement comes to the forefront is because there will not be any concept of non-alignment without him. You see, when Nehru used the term non-alignment at the Colombo Conference of 1954, the word instantly became popularized. Now, he did not coin the term. That credit, however, goes to V.K. Menon, the then Defense Minister of India. However, it was Nehru who first used the term non-alignment in the context we now recognize it to be, and also popularized the term to such an extent that it became a permanent entry in the Dictionary of International Relations. But is that where Nehru's contributions to the non-aligned movement stop? Is it only about him giving the name? Absolutely not. Let's now look at the various other contributions which Nehru had in the growth of the non-aligned movement, and also how his ideology shaped the legacy of the movement itself. Now, when we were discussing the objectives of the non-aligned movement, we saw how the movement is particularly anti-imperialist in nature and works hard to make sure that any form of imperialism is abolished for good. Now, this anti-imperialist stance itself comes from Nehru, because Nehru himself was at the forefront of leading the fight against imperialism when he was a freedom fighter in the Indian independence struggle. So Nehru started his political career as a freedom fighter, and he was at the forefront of the Indian independence struggle itself. Now, when he was a freedom fighter, his stance of anti-imperialism became very clear. And when India finally achieved independence, Nehru made sure while drafting the foreign policy of India that he will work hard to raise the cause of the third world countries or the underdeveloped countries, and also aim to eradicate every trace of imperialism that existed. This eventually will go on to form a base of the movement itself. Now, the concept of non-alignment was not something which came to him magically at the Colombo Conference. He had been refining the concept for a long time then. In fact, this process began way before the Colombo Conference, in fact even before the independence of India. Now, if you remember, it was the Indian National Congress which led the independence struggle of India. And in the Congress, Nehru was selected to be the person most able and fit to lead global or foreign affairs due to his diplomatic personality and also his good understanding of international relations. Now, it was thus Nehru who was given the task of settling a foreign policy for the Congress party. And he made that foreign policy centered on the ideals of peace and non-violence from the ideals of Mahatma Gandhi himself, who Nehru considered to be his mentor. When India finally achieved its independence, this foreign policy of the Congress party became the foreign policy of India itself. Now, the very tenets of non-alignment itself are a product of the Indian foreign policy. And India's foreign policy was drafted by Jawaharlal Nehru. And not only did he draft this policy, he also practiced it because he included into his responsibilities the role of foreign minister as well. So Nehru's tactful practice of foreign policy in fact popularized the concept of non-alignment itself. And he, along with his core allies, together drafted the movement of non-alignment. In this picture we see Jawaharlal Nehru along with his daughter Indira Gandhi making a diplomatic visit to one of the core allies of Nehru, which will eventually become a part of the non-aligned movement itself. Now, it was through the efforts and conviction of Nehru himself that the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa were able to alienate themselves from the superpowers of that time, namely USA and USSR. Now, how could Nehru so easily convince them to do so? This is because Nehru was a brilliant orator. Now, Nehru in fact goes down in history as one of the finest orators that India had. Now, in this chapter, we saw various instances of Nehru making speeches in reference to non-alignment. And we have to remember that the audience of those speeches were the members of the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa, and later on, even Latin America and Eastern Europe. And they were able to be convinced by Nehru's oratory prowess, and therefore were able to select the stance of non-alignment for themselves. This is what Nehru said in a speech to the various newly independent nations of why they should be staying non-aligned from the two superpower blocks. He said that by aligning ourselves with one power, you, the nations, surrender your opinion. You give up the policy you normally pursue because somebody else wants you to pursue another policy. So we can understand how Nehru is being able to convince the nations that if one allies with a particular superpower bloc, they are practically handing away the keys to their own sovereignty, and therefore they should stay non-aligned. So we can understand how his oratory prowess was a very big contributor to the popularity and success of the non-aligned movement. Nehru played a very important role in the development of NAM itself. In fact, if you remember, the seeds of NAM were sown at the Asian Relations Conference of 1947. And this Asian Relations Conference was held in New Delhi. And this conference was the brainchild of none other than Nehru himself. And this makes him the chief architect of the non-aligned movement. In this picture we can see Nehru at the stage of the Asian Relations Conference alongside Gandhi. Now, this conference under the leadership of Nehru marked the emergence of India in the international political sphere and also declared opposition towards any form of colonialism that was existing at that point of time. And Nehru in his own speech called for all Asian nations to be united, to give a reminder to the world that they are now a new force to reckon with and they have an active part in international relations as well. And together they will lead the fight against colonial subjugation as they will no longer tolerate any such forms of colonial oppression. So you can understand the role Nehru played not only in the Asian Relations Conference but also the emergence of NAM itself. The next contribution of Nehru in the path of the non-aligned movement was with the Panchsheel. If you remember, the Panchsheel refers to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence which were signed between India and China, and later this became an integral part of the movement itself. Now Nehru, in association with the Chinese premier of that time, Zhou Enlai, declared in 1954 these 5 principles of peaceful coexistence or Panchsheel. Can you answer this question? When was the Panchsheel Agreement signed between India and China? Was it in the year 1951, 1954, 1955 or 1956? The correct answer is 1954. The Panchsheel principles were carefully drafted by Nehru himself, and they were designed to promote world peace. World peace through prosperity, cooperation, and also good relations between nations. Along with world peace, it was to also preserve the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the newly independent nations. In fact, Nehru envisioned these 5 principles to be the base of all international relations between the nations, particularly the ones following a policy of non-alignment, and also be the basis of the entire non-aligned movement itself. And Nehru had high hopes for Panchsheel. In fact, he believed that the nation which pursues Panchsheel also is able to avert war of all kinds. Panchsheel eventually went on to become the base of all international relations for all member nations of NAM. And this is a very primary contribution of Nehru in the growth of the non-aligned movement. Next contribution of Nehru would be towards the Belgrade Conference. The Belgrade Conference is considered to be the first summit of the non-aligned movement, and it was at the Belgrade Conference when the non-aligned movement officially took its birth. Now Nehru took a leading role in this first summit of the non-aligned movement at Belgrade in the year 1961. In fact, Nehru was one of the co-hosts of this conference. Now, at this conference, Nehru played an instrumental role in issuing a statement which emphasized on the disastrous effects of any future wars, and thus called on the member nations who were present at the conference for promoting peace and also for leading a movement for complete disarmament. Therefore, he wished to put an end to the Cold War situation at this time and urged the nations present there to push for peace as well as complete disarmament. Nehru and his policies were heavily influential in the drafting of the 27-point declaration, also known as the Belgrade Declaration, which was the outcome document of this particular conference. It was the Belgrade Declaration, in fact, which set forth the principles of the non-aligned movement and also gave a list of objectives of this particular movement, the ones we already have seen. Over here we can see a picture of Nehru at the Belgrade Conference. Now let us see the role which Nehru played in de-escalating the bloc politics of the Cold War. Nehru was opposed to the very idea of the power blocs and thus refused to get India drawn into the military blocs of USA and Soviet Russia by pursuing his policy of non-alignment and in turn giving the policy a better understanding. When the Korean crisis occurred in 1950, India under Nehru strongly condemned North Korea's aggression against South Korea. And he also was made the chairman of a committee set up by the UN to bring the conflict to an end and to deal with the aftermath. Similarly, in 1956, India under Nehru took a strong stand against the Anglo-French action targeted towards Egypt on the Suez Canal issue. Nehru thus showed exemplary diplomatic ability to deal with these situations, and it earned him international prominence as an able diplomat, making him more acceptable and accessible for newly independent nations. And Nehru was enshrined with the ideals of non-violence, Mahatma Gandhi being his mentor. And Jawaharlal Nehru envisaged peace through good relations, not through war. And these good relations need to be maintained with the neighboring countries of a nation, and only through good relations can they pursue in international sphere. Now we already saw the Panchsheel, or the 5 principles of mutual coexistence. It was born out of Nehru's idea of having peace through good relations. were supposed to establish good relations between India and its neighbor China. But Panchsheel was never supposed to be restricted to India and China alone, and Nehru made sure that the Panchsheel becomes a base of all international relations for the non-aligned member nations. And Nehru's Panchsheel preached the maintenance of mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Through this, Nehru realized that peace between nations could be achieved. Now, Nehru's promotion of world peace was not just idealistic. Nehru had realistic understanding as well. Jawaharlal Nehru in fact understood the need to defend a nation to meet external challenges. Every nation often has to make such choices through which they can defend themselves against external challenges. Not always can one turn the other cheek. However, Nehru always insisted that diplomacy and negotiations should be the tool of settling disputes, not war and conflict. And the use of diplomacy and negotiations were to be employed till the very end. So we can understand that Nehru's promotion of world peace was set on realistic grounds, and this made non-aligned movement much more popular among nations. In fact, Nehru's policies and principles elevated him to the position of a political philosopher in India. And this further expanded the reach of the movement, as Nehru at this point of time was attributed to be the chief architect of this movement, and since he had achieved the position of a political philosopher, people could trust the movement more. However, Nehru's most significant contribution to the non-aligned movement was perhaps his honesty. Nehru quite clearly did not pursue any ulterior motives while promoting the non-aligned movement, and also was very clear with the member nations. He did not for once give any unrealistic illusions to these member nations. He never said that by pursuing non-alignment, one can become as powerful as USA or USSR. But he was clear that by pursuing this policy, the third world nations can truly establish peace in the world. And he pledged that the third world nations have the role of preserving peace in the world. And in the third world, Nehru soon became a symbol of hope. And that is because of Nehru's brutal honesty. Nehru left such a legacy behind that India continued to be a leading country in the non-aligned movement under the successive prime ministers after Nehru's death. In fact, in 1983, the Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi hosted the Delhi summit of the non-aligned movement. We see a picture of Indira Gandhi hosting this summit over here. The policy of non-alignment and the pledge to the non-aligned movement, in fact, still remains an integral part of Indian foreign policy. And in this picture over here, we can see Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, addressing the summit of the non-aligned movement of the year 2020. So therefore, Nehru's legacy, as well as India's contributions to a non-aligned movement, still remain. And this remains primarily because of the contributions of Nehru himself. So in this lecture, we were able to understand the role and the contributions that Nehru had towards the non-aligned movement. In the subsequent lecture, we will be looking at the achievements and also understand the relevance of NAM in the current period. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So register for free now.